Welcome. My name is Danny Arguetti. I'm the Mindfulness Manager at the University of Washington's Recreation Department. Today, we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about yoga props and the benefit that they can offer. Regardless if you're new to yoga or if you've been practicing for many years, props can provide support for accessibility in a posture, to deepen an experience, and to have a new way to connect to a familiar pose. We are very fortunate that in many of our practice spaces we have a wide array of props. But even if you don't have official yoga props handy, you can always get creative and use similar shape objects, whether you're at home or in another space. One prop that's valuable is called a bolster. If you don't have something like this in your space, you can always fold a blanket and make it around the same dimensions. A bolster or folded blanket can be used to support a seated posture by creating more uplift for the low back. Particularly if your knees are higher than your waistline, that's an indication that your hips are tight and that you'll be rounded if you sit on the floor without prop support. So using a prop can help that added spaciousness in the low spine. A bolster or folded blanket can also be effective in several postures where a seat is required. For example, in the seated forward bend, a bolster can be utilized in the same way as the seat to create more uplift for the spine, so there isn't as much rounding. Also useful in a pose like head to knee posture or the seated wide angle forward bend. All these places that involve a seat and potential to round the low back can be eased by the use of a bolster or folded blanket. Another great place for a bolster or a folded blanket is to utilize it underneath of the knees in the final resting pose of Shavasana, corpse pose. This is a way to relieve pressure from the low back. Again, a folded blanket works just as well here. In addition, a folded blanket can work nicely for knee support. In this case, I have a knee pad, but a blanket folded in the similar proportion can also support if your knees are sensitive or if you're practicing on a harder wood floor. Blocks are also a wonderful prop to utilize in the practice, whether you have one or two. With two blocks, can be a wonderful support for a lunge pose, especially if the hamstrings are a little bit tighter here. But this also creates lift out of my shoulders. Without the blocks, I would have to use little tent fingers, but sometimes that creates more compression. And if the limbs are a little bit shorter, then it can make it a bit more challenging here. Especially in any sort of movement, the blocks are going to relieve hamstring tightness. So that can be very useful as well here in the movement part of the experience, more access. And with all these props, they work on a spectrum, so I'm using the highest setting here. My hamstrings are quite tight, but I could play with a lower height setting. I have 3, and that will give more stretch for the hamstrings in this particular movement. A block is also really useful in some of the standing postures like mountain pose or the standing half moon posture, or even in chair pose. Ideally, I'm going to try to match the block to my hip width distance to fire up the inner adductors, muscles that tend to be pretty weak. So having this stability here in the legs for various postures can actually give me some added muscle memory post-practice or when I'm practicing without the block itself. Super useful there. A block can also come in handy in the twisting chair pose. Having the engagement of the block at the inner legs will help stabilize the hips to be more even and the knees to track in line as I spin and rotate. Other places the blocks are handy are for postures like triangle pose. So many people, when they reach just for the hand in triangle pose, they'll collapse a lot of their lower body. So the block can create a bit more lift through the especially lower side of the body here. From this posture of triangle pose, a block is obviously going to be very useful for a balancing pose, like balancing half moon posture without the block. It's not necessarily horrible, but I am collapsing more into my side body and I just don't have as much lift through the torso. So block's gonna provide lots of elongation here. Two blocks or one block can be extremely handy for this pose, sometimes called the intense pose or pyramid posture. So again, blocks really help out with tight hamstrings. So there's an opportunity here. I'm bending through my front knee, but using the blocks to dive more deeply into my hamstring without compromising my low back. And once again, I can use lower block settings depending on what's happening in the hamstrings. And this is a place where you could actually take it further. So if your hamstrings are more open, you can use your forearms onto your blocks at whatever height setting, and that will actually intensify the experience here. One block or two blocks can be super useful for warrior 3 pose to provide stability and support, or if you're going into a standing splits or a little Shiva squat, the blocks are going to be helpful for these types of movements as well. Again, working with the hamstrings in a posture like a wide angle forward fold. Micro bending the knees is important, but a block at center to rest the forehead or to allow the hands to land on can also offer a little bit more support. Blocks can be handy in other postures for little crash pad support in the crow pose. I can actually land my forehead here to make sure I don't crash forward. That's a great way to build some stability. Blocks can be used for core engagement, core exercises. They can be utilized in bridge pose. Again, same action as we did in standing to fire up through the inner leg muscles. And they can also be used in bridge pose for restorative version. You've probably done before. Can be lovely. You have your 3 height options depending on how much extension you want in your spine. A block can also be extremely useful for a quad lunge stretch. I'm going to start with the block on the highest setting. It's the same side of the leg that I'm stretching. By using the block here, I can reach more back behind. It's an easier reach for the back foot. Now, for some people, even that support's not going to be enough. So this is where our friendly tie is going to come in and help out as well. So it might be the use of the block and the tie. The tie can sometimes be a little bit of a pain to loop onto the back foot. This is why starting out with the block is going to be the first choice, and then the tie as the second choice. Another handy yoga tool is the yoga tie or strap. One of the simplest places is going to be if shoulders are a little bit more contracted, the upper shoulders. You can grab onto a tie and hold it wider than shoulder width apart to give a bit more freedom in something like a forward fold. Or this would also translate well into a floor posture. Locust pose, sometimes this interlace of the hands can be challenging, so the strap is going to be useful here to create broadness for the shoulders again. The tie can also be beneficial if the shoulders are tight for some specific shoulder stretches. For the cow facing pose, so if the reach of the hands can be very challenging, reaching to the ends of the tie is going to be super useful as well here. A tie can help out if the hamstrings are a little bit tighter as well for hamstring opening postures. You can use the tie to create more of support in the hinge here. And this can also intensify the experience as well. Finally, ties can also be extremely useful for certain postures like binding poses. So for some people, the limb proportion makes it challenging. When they bind, they'll actually round and be quite a bit off of alignment. So this is where utilizing the tie is going to offer support so I can reach and connect. By holding the tie, can actually create more openness through the body as opposed to the collapse. So those are a few ways that you can utilize some handy props to help out with postures, take yourself deeper, offer more support for what's going on in your own body. And that's just the beginning. So there's lots of other poses to explore. Props are our friends, so utilize them and enjoy your exploration with them.